want to start with a personal anecdote. You mentioned some of my past employments. And 10 years ago, my first job was in Mexico at the University of Guanajuato, which is a very small provincial town. And I started looking into the history of classical liberalism and Mexican economic thought. And my colleagues were laughing at me because they said, if you're going to write a paper, it will be a very short one. And I found out that not only is that not true, because there is really quite a rich tradition in the Spanish-speaking countries and in the Spanish-speaking literature connected to liberal and classical liberal thoughts. There is also, surprise, surprise, Hayek and Mises trace in Mexico that was originated in the 1940s, when both of them were sort of looking for their intellectual homes. And it so happens that Hayek and Mises were invited by an organization that is called Asociación Mexicana de la Cultura, Mexican Association of Culture, which was quite an impressive group of people who were interested in sort of bringing together thinkers in Austrian classical liberal tradition and influenced really the climate of opinion in Mexico. And both of them were invited at least once or twice. And Hayek, in the 1946, when he was invited to Mexico City, I think he also gave lectures at the University of Guadalajara, gave lectures on the meaning of competition. So that was what he chose to be something that the Mexican scholars and businessmen and intellectuals should hear about. The other paper that he lectured on was employment and public expenditure. So, but the paper on the meaning of competition was originated in the 1940s. I think it traces back to a lecture that he gave at Princeton University. And then, of course, it became quite an important paper. And I would like to elaborate a little bit on that in terms of what is it that I understand the meaning of competition in Hayek really is, and how it inspires some of my work. From those affiliations, you can see that I've benefited greatly from the proximity to the King's College's Center for Research in Governance and Society, run by Mark and a couple of colleagues. But I'm also moving on now to my own country, the Czech Republic, Palacký University in Olomouc. And I'm putting together materials for the habilitation procedure. So there will be a little bit of a self-indulgent moment where I will go through some of my past work and try to relate it to Hayek's argument on the meaning of competition, and I hope you will tolerate a little bit of that indulgence. So if you think with Hayek in terms of what do we talk about when we talk about competition, first and foremost, really, Hayek would say that competition is a procedure for discovering facts. What kind of facts? Like what things are goods? Which goods are scarce? What is the value of certain kinds of other goods? Because we don't really know them. We can't assume that we know these before the process of competition starts. But also, if you look at the lecture that I mentioned to you on the meaning of competition, at the end of this paper, which really is quite a prominent place where you can put some really quite important messages, Hayek says, well, what competition really actually is a process of the formation of opinion. And so we have facts, we have opinions. Is it one? Is it the other? And we've already heard, is it both maybe? Are they somehow related? And we've already heard about the importance of opinion in terms of, well, what is it that determines the different kinds of power relations from the previous sessions? There really is a process of formation of opinion that has an important implications for this. So competition as the process of formation of opinion, this is an argument that Hayek formulates in the 40s as a response to his friend for some time and colleague in London, Lionel Robbins. And of course, there is this really important essay on the nature and significance of economic science, which until today provides us with the definition of economics, where we think, well, the ends are given. We have no business as economists as trying to figure out why people want what they want. The means how to satisfy those ends are given too. That's technology. Again, that's not for economists to inquire. But the relationship between the means and the end, that's really what the economic science is and should be about. So the definition from this essay, Robbins posits that economics is the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means that have alternative uses. that makes sense as a statement, but it's usually problematic as an extension of the Walrasian research program. And some of the scholars, I think it was Interdisciplinary, that mentioned this is really the equilibrium research program that assumes that we know what are the relevant ends they are given, and we know what are the relevant means to satisfy those ends, which are given too. And so for Hayek, this Walrasian agenda was hugely problematic. He argued that ends are not given. Rather, the knowledge of consumers or buyers, the knowledge that they're supposed to possess in the state of competitive equilibrium, as assumed by Walrasian scholars, and at some point people like Lionel Robbins, cannot legitimately be assumed to be at their command before the process of competition starts. Actually, the knowledge of the alternatives before them is the result of what happens on the market. So which things are actually goods is something that we maybe don't really know to begin with. So what matters here is activities such as advertising, and is the whole organization of the market that serves as a sort of a process of spreading that information. The means can't really be taken as given either. And as far as producers and sellers, Hayek argues in that paper on the meaning of competition that was originally published in 1946, well, we can't really assume that we know, the producers, but also the economists or the whole society for that matter, what are the technologies, the means with which we can satisfy those ends at lowest cost. Again, this is something that we discovered through the process of competition. But yet, this knowledge which is assumed to be given is one of the main points, where it is only through the process of competition that these facts will be discovered. So in a workshop, in a meeting at the IEA, I think 1 or 2 years ago, on the meaning of competition, there was a couple of excellent contributions, and one of them summarizes, that's again Velianovsky's summary here, Velianovsky's summary, that there are basically 2 points with which we can summarize the sort of received wisdom about what the meaning of competition is. And we say, well, first, we can say that competition is a contest. It's rivalrous at that. That's what Hayek makes as a first point. And what is maybe less obvious, but more important here, is that competition is an efficient method in terms of dealing with imperfect information and decentralized knowledge. And I think this is a useful starting point, and I'd like to broaden it and really inquire into what does it mean to say that competition is a process of opinion formation and how it sort of widens this definition. Because my understanding from when I teach and talk with economists is really when we interpret the Hayekian message on the meaning of competition and how it criticizes the 19th century Walrasian paradigm, which we still have as a mainstream set of thoughts that we teach to our economic students. We assume that the means and ends are given. We say, well, Hayek says precisely through the process of competition, which is a process of learning, we discover what is it that people's preferences are, and we discover what are the technologies and the means to satisfy them at lowest cost. How do we know that this happens? We look at prices, which are signals, and under certain conditions, those prices correspond to the lowest possible cost of making things. That happens in the process of competition, and unlike Walra, we can't assume that this is already the case at the beginning when the process of competition starts. So I think this is a useful starting point, but I'd really like to sort of bring that question up and try for us to zone in a little bit on this. What are we actually discovering? And what can we refer to when we talk about facts? What do we mean when we say opinions? This is just hair splitting. Does the distinction matter? If it matters, why should we look into it? I don't think it's just hair splitting. I actually think this is really an important distinction from which we can learn something. So I'm going to show you a couple of quotes from Hayek, which I think are really quite meaningful. And they're all mostly really from the paper on the meaning of competition, from the lectures that he gave originally at Princeton, and at some point to the Mexican Association for Culture. Hayek says that the conception of the economic system as somehow divisible and categorizable into distinct markets or separate commodities is really something that we made up. This is just something that the economist's profession created for the convenience of being able to calculate certain kinds of coefficients of elasticity, but really to start with, there is really no such thing as a clearly divisible economic system into distinct markets for separate commodities. Again, this very system of classification is actually the outcome, and it's in a permanent flux of that competitive process. Hayek continues and says that the process of competition actually is what creates this very unity and coherence. I'm going to give you a couple of hopefully a little bit more tangible and empirical examples that can help illustrate why I think this is important beyond the abstract statements. So we can't presuppose the coherence of the economic system when we think of it as one market. Hayek would say that when we talk about competition, and this is really what sort of motivates my curiosity for the past 10 years, we usually take for granted that there somehow already is a highly organized market, a fully standardized commodity produced by many producers. Maybe some of you who taught or studied economics classes, usually when we talk about markets, we start with drawing the famous Marshallian scissors, supply and demand. And somehow it's like as if we knew what it means to be a buyer for this specific market. We know what quantities mean, we know how to count the units, and we actually even know what it means to exchange money for those quantities on those markets. Hayek says you can't assume that when you start talking about the process of competition. We can't assume that the best ways of producing the commodity, its character and uses, are most of the time known to nearly the same degree to all members of the market. Rather, he would suggest, to properly understand the real meaning of competition and what it is, it might be better for us to consider in some detail the case when the different commodities could not be readily classed into distinct groups. So he might be talking about cases of genuine novelty. We're looking at something, we don't really know what it is, we don't know how to classify it. Is it A? Is it B? What happens then? So here comes the moment where I jump into some of the work that I've been writing in the last 10 years, and it criticizes this position, also formulated, spelled out by Oliver Williamson, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, that starts his 1976, I think, book with a very sort of powerful and provocative statement that in the beginning there were markets. This is, of course, a sort of a Coasian story where we say, well, markets have costs, there are transaction costs, and these costs become too high, we have firms. We bypass the decentralized coordination markets by some kind of a businessman, by some kind of an entrepreneur. But before that, there are markets. And my question has always been, well, is there a life before markets? Is there something that needs to happen through the process of competition before we can even start talking about these markets? And I think this really connects to the Hayekian story of the meaning of competition as a process of opinion formation, and it really goes way beyond the discovery of preferences, prices, and the lowest costs at which these preferences can be satisfied. So the first example that I'd like to give you in terms of showing the life before markets is the work that I did quite a long time ago on the emergence of surrogate motherhood market in the US. And I won't be really going very deep into what happens in those papers. I will try to give you sort of one-liners, and maybe you can look at them or talk with me about them later. But for the surrogate motherhood in the US to be a market where property rights are contractually exchanging hands that are then enforceable by judges in courts, we need to distinguish this transaction from adoption. Because if there is money and if there is adoption, we are usually dealing with baby selling, human trafficking. This is really incompatible with most of the market societies. It will never be legal. It will never be a functional market that will be in which the transactions will be enforceable. So what you can see that there is a process of classification. What is it that we're actually dealing with when we look at the transaction in the surrogate motherhood market? And in 1985, there was a judge in Michigan who had the case before them, and she says, we have no definition of motherhood on our books, because obviously we never need it for technical reasons that changed in 1978 with the introduction of in vitro fertilization. But now we have to introduce three ways in which motherhood can be established: by gestation, by genes, and thirdly, and this is the innovation, which is really the crucial formation of opinion bit, by intent. So you become a mother by signing a paper saying, when I initiate the interaction where the egg is fertilized in vitro, I become a mother. So therefore, the person who carries the child to term is not the mother. It's a carrier. It's a gestational carrier. I'm not buying the child. I am buying the gestational services. And that is a process that doesn't just happen. It actually requires years of efforts of different kinds of stakeholders. And it is not just the business people, it is not just the lawyers. And there's really quite a fascinating story that shows you that the competition as a process of formation of opinion goes beyond discovery of information that can be encapsulated in prices and costs. This sort of brings me to more mundane cases that you can find. This is a recent article where regulators in the US, UK, are trying to figure out whether this product called Xi'an is a drink or is a food. And that really has a big implications in terms of how are you going to regulate and tax products like these. And I could really give you a list of these cases where on a quite a daily basis we have to make these decisions in terms of how one thing relates to another, and is the process of buying and selling, exchanging property rights through contractual means compatible with the thing, with the artifact that we're actually exchanging. So in another paper that I worked on, we introduced the concept called exemplary goods. And we thought this was quite important because we pushed the argument that competition is a process through which prices as signals are being discovered, signals as pointers in terms of what is it that I should do as a business person, what is it that I should do as a consumer. And one thing becomes more costly, I substitute it with another thing that is like this thing that I was buying before, but now is a little bit more affordable to me. And we said, it's not just prices that are discovered through the process of competition, it's also the qualities of the good, because these qualities can't be assumed to be given prior to the process of competition, and it's also the qualities that are discovered through this process. And we said, well, in this process of discovering the relevant qualities that economists typically have been thinking are really somehow essentially given and are very clear to the analyst, the economist knows what we're looking at somehow. We introduced the idea of exemplary goods, and we thought these are really coordination devices that serve as focal points. And we can say, well, is education becoming more like Netflix? When I'm consuming university education and watching recorded lectures, some students have been asking me, could you do a little bit of a previously on? And you can see that now there is this process through which we discover qualities of the good that we are producing and consuming. And again, this is not given somehow or legislatively mandated before the process of competition starts. As Victoria mentioned at the beginning in the generous introduction, we also looked into a correspondence between Ludwig Lachmann, who was Hayek's student and quite prominent and very creative, influential Austrian economist, and his correspondence with an English economist called G.L.S. Shackle. And we found that Hayek was really, that Lachmann was actually really quite skeptical about this story that prices are signals that are somehow unequivocally telling us what to do. When prices go up, economists think, well, quantity goes down. Lachmann says this sort of bypasses an important step, and that is the understanding of the signal. And Lachmann says prices are a little bit like signposts. I recently found, and I was quite slow in that, but Charles Taylor, a philosopher, says, do you know how to read an arrow? Ask, where is the post? Well, you just go over there, there is a road, and you just follow the arrow. Of course, everyone knows how to follow an arrow, but do we? How do you know to follow a signal like a price? How do you know to follow a signal like a signpost, maybe a traffic sign? Yesterday, we had a conversation of the panic that some of us are encountered with when we find on a bus stop the traffic, the time schedule. That's a signpost that requires certain kinds of skill in terms of interpreting and decoding the signal so that we know when to wait for a bus, when the next bus comes. So we made an argument here that in that process of competition as a discovery procedure, the production of these artifacts that we call instruments of interpretation are really actually quite important, because we're dealing with these cognitive artifacts that allow us to know what to do when we deal with things like property rights, like prices, like contracts. And these cognitive devices are really an important part of the process that really goes back to Hayek's teacher, which was Carl Menger. And that's another part of the work that I'm wishing to connect this story with. Because Menger was really quite unconvinced by the Smithian story of where does the division of labor come from. We know that if we want to explain development, why certain countries are rich, first 3 chapters in The Wealth of Nations have to do with the division of labor. If you ask Smith, what is it that's actually causing a division of labor, he says, it's some kind of a psychological propensity for us to exchange. And Menger says, no, this is not really all that convincing. We exchange because we are wired to exchange. Menger says it's actually a growth of knowledge, a growth of causal relations between how things hang together that leads to the division of knowledge, that leads to greater diversity of possible combination of different kinds of knowledge artifacts, that ultimately leads to the division of labor. Here is where Menger is sort of putting Smith, standing him on his head. And we thought that if you start thinking of different kinds of instruments of interpretation as sort of artifacts, cognitive artifacts, that are necessary for different kinds of production processes to take place. You look at an exchange where a child changes hands for money. How do you interpret this exchange? Are we buying and selling the child, or is there some kind of an intent that makes it a different kinds of a transaction? The kind of a cognitive infrastructure on which these exchanges operate are really quite crucially complementary to the combination of possible physical capital goods that are thinkable and even possible for us. And we thought, well, this is really quite an important story in Menger's theory of growth and development as a growth of knowledge, of which the division of labor is a consequence. And finally, in a book that my friends Martin Ricketts and Terence Keeley are actually a part of, and I hope I'm not embarrassing you with mentioning that you are a part of this book, because I think this is really quite a useful project. We were making the case that it is really the shared community governance of certain kinds of knowledge artifacts and infrastructures that makes a proper and useful functioning of markets possible. And it is usually this sort of a community governance, and you can think of it as this kind of a knowledge commons in the Ostromian spirit, that is usually overlooked in the literature, and people just generally tend to think of it as a sort of a form of private governance as opposed to state or public governance. I'm not going to really bore you with the details of this table, but you can see these practices that we identify, such as the formation of rules and their interpretation, the administration of the rules. I think, again, some of the previous lecture mentioned that Hayek was really in favor of the state being in charge of registering property claims on land, running cadastral registries. So that's administration of property claims, enforcing and conflict resolution. We think these are all practices that involve different kinds of knowledge artifacts that spill over from actions and interactions within the markets and actually make the exchanges in markets possible in the first place. And we think this sort of a spillover relationship, that we term joint production or co-production of this knowledge, broader knowledge that goes really beyond just the buying and selling, the exchange of property rights, really has something to do with the story of how the knowledge that is more than an individual knowledge stored in our brains, but more of a socially extended mind, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, really helps us to understand the process of competition. So when we talk about knowledge here, we have a broader understanding of what knowledge is. A broad array of intellectual and cultural resources, legal and intellectual infrastructures, things like beliefs, opinions, mental models, the shared classification schemes, institutional aspects such as rules and norms, these instruments of interpretation that I was briefly mentioning, the price system and the interpretation of the prices and rules. We think that all of this really has something to do with what is it that is being produced in the process of a competition. These are the relevant aspects of knowledge. And I think to illustrate how we sort of think about this, I'm going to show you a quote by Harold Berman from his book on Law and Language. I forgot the name of it. And Berman says there is a process of communication that happens in families. So imagine a family conversation at the dinner table. He says it is plain that each person helps to create the family community, and that at the same time each is created by it. Dad, Mom, Johnny, Sue, what happened in school today? The teacher said she would like to talk to you, Dad. So Berman would say these interchanges are a process whereby each person affirms, sustains, renews, and creates the family, and at the same time they are a process whereby the family gives the character of the father, mother, son, daughter to each of the members. And Berman would contend that the same process of communication through language also takes place in the larger families to which we belong. And there he means neighborhood, university, profession, the factory, the city, the nation, the church, civilization, the mankind. And this was written a while ago. The 2013 is a reprint. But basically, the hunch of the story that I'd like to sort of illustrate by this Berman quotation is I think this process really happens in markets as well. And it happens every time that we go and buy and sell something, or even if we don't buy and sell, even if we just understand what does it mean to put a price on certain kinds of exchanges. What does it mean to decide whether the drink is a drink or the drink is a food? And the last little bit that I'd like to mention here to you is really how I think we can extend the thinking and the discussion on the meaning of competition, because there has emerged recently quite a rich and I would say inspiring literature on socially extended cognition. And I think this really is somehow in tune with Hayek's work on mind as an order, sensory order, his book on and his work on psychology. And I think the most prominent representative of this literature recently has been a philosopher called Sean Gallagher, and I'm going to give you some quotes from him. That also illustrate how I basically think about useful ways of conceptualizing the meaning of competition in the Hayekian vein and bringing it forward. Gallagher would say, buying or not buying a good in the market is something that enacts the market. Engaging in these epistemic actions when we bid or sell, it enacts the market such that the market wouldn't exist without these actions. Every participant is in a symbiotic system. They profit from whatever the system as a whole has to offer. But we also contribute, only a small part though. The tasks, jobs, the roles of others in the system co-define and enable one's own task. One does not have to perform them or even think about them while nevertheless benefiting from the overall outcome of the system. So I said I was really quite delighted and happy that I can continue this discussion after lunch, given the talks that you heard this morning, because I think there is really a sort of a change of focus from this big Schumpeterian entrepreneur and his important social role in convincing people that they should act, responsible or prudent or whichever value you want to substitute, to sort of a micro level, along maybe a little bit the lines that Mark introduced to you, where it's really each one of us that at every moment are jointly producing as a byproduct the element on which markets exist and function. So that brings me to the original question in terms of who or what is it that competes in markets then. And I would really like to sort of put it this way, that the process of formation of opinion really facilitates the extension of our shared knowledge. So when we talk about competition in the Mengerian spirit, this is a process of learning. Knowledge, as I mentioned to you here, is not merely the personal competence, but rather an aspect of socially extended cognition. And what competes, I would submit here, is the narratives, the interpretive frames or the categories or classification schemes through which we see the world and that allow us to interact, exchange, and buy or sell. And with that, I thank you for your attention.